Now, our next speaker is one of the best researchers and writers for the movement against Zionist domination in the world. His books Barren Metal, A History of Capitalism, as the conflict between usury and labour, the Jewish revolutionary spirit and its impact on world history, Libido Dominandi, Sexual Liberation as Political Control, Degenerate Moderns, as mentioned, Modernity as Rationalised Sexual Behaviour, The Jews and Moral Subversion, Dionysus Rising, The Birth of Cultural Revolution out of the Spirit of Music. These books, among others, have led to a deeper thinking about the causes of our civilization's present malaise. He is the editor of the excellent monthly journal Culture Wars, and he's a frequent commentator on Red Ice Radio, Press TV, and Russia Today. He is Professor E. Michael Jones.
It's an honor to be here. I know I'm a foreigner here, but thank you for inviting me at this historical moment. Historical moment. What do I mean about this historical moment? 1 month ago today, I was in South Bend, Indiana, where I live, and Donald Trump showed up in town and held a political rally, and there were 5,000 people in the room. And I said later, those were the most important people. Those 5,000 people were the important people, because they were the people of Indiana who had suddenly awoken to the fact that they were a colony, a conquered province of Wall Street, and that their jobs, 1 week before Donald Trump arrived, the Carrier Air Conditioning Company had relocated its plant to Mexico. And whenever Donald Trump opened his mouth and talked about the Carrier Air Conditioning plant leaving for Mexico, there was a roar from the crowd, and this was the consciousness that Indiana had reached at this point. 4 years ago, Indiana voted for Mitt Romney, who was a looter for the oligarchs, worked for Bain Capital, would come into Indiana, load these companies down with debt. They'd go belly up and everybody would lose their jobs and he'd walk off with a lot of money. In this 4 years, the consciousness has arisen to the point where people in Indiana finally understand what's going on. And what is going on? What is going on? In Brexit and in the Trump campaign, we have an uprising against the oligarchs. An uprising against what Roger Cohen, it was in the New York Times, he said it, so it must be true. Roger Cohen called the smug elites. This is an uprising against the smug elites, okay? We are familiar with uprisings in the United States. We uprose against you folk and celebrate it every year on July 4th. Well, what we realize, having done that, is it's not so much the uprising, which is important, but what happens after the uprising is important as well. And if what happens after the uprising is that the old boss is simply a new version, or the new boss is simply a new version of the old boss, you can often end up worse than you were beforehand. And if there's ever a sad story in history, it's the sad story of revolutions leading to a worse situation. And I'd like to talk about that today. But first, I'd like to talk about myself. As my children say, this is all about me. It's not all about me. But 1 year ago, I was in Guadalajara in Mexico, and asked to speak at a conference, and who should show up at the conference but David Duke. Does anyone know David Duke? Big cheer for David Duke. So David said to me, I didn't know you were coming. And I said, I didn't know you were coming either. And I said, if I'd known you were coming, I probably wouldn't have come, but here I am. And here we are, and David Duke spent, I spent the week trying to convince David Duke to become Catholic. And David Duke spent the week trying to convince me that I was a white guy. And both of us failed. I said to David, I'm not white, I'm biracial. I'm Irish and German. I have as a result a genetic predisposition to multiple personality disorder. And I've had it all my life. And I've always, I'm always being the victim of mistaken identity for some reason or other. I don't know why. I was at a conference in Washington a couple of years ago. And someone there you probably also might have known, Mr. Tyndall. Remember Mr. John Tyndall? Yeah. And he's there with another, a guy I used to know by the name of Sam Francis, who used to write for Chronicles magazine. The late Sam Francis died at a fairly young age. And Mr. Tyndall got up and gave us a talk. And the talk was about how we are supposed to be proud because we're white people. And so, okay, well, what are we supposed to be proud of? And then he came up with an explanation. Think of Elizabethan England. And I thought, Elizabethan England? And my friend was there, my friend Jerry Bruin, and I looked at him and he looked at me and I thought, Elizabethan England, I remember those days. That was the day when if you were a Catholic priest and they caught you saying the Mass, they would draw and quarter you, and then they'd boil your entrails in oil, and then they'd hang the rest up. And the birds would eat you. And needless to say, I thought, well, wait a minute, why should I be so enthusiastic about Elizabethan England? And Jerry Bruin had the same thing. So anyway, the talk is over, and he, being the type of person he is, he raised his hand, he asked a question, and he said, are the Irish white? And Mr. Tyndall got a disgusted look on his face. And he said, of course the Irish are white. My mother's Irish. Okay. All right. At this point, Sam Francis turned to him. And Sam Francis said, are Jews white? And Mr. Tyndall said, I don't know. Let me get back to you on that. That's what I'd like to talk about today. Now, I got in a lot of trouble talking about this before. There was Sam Francis up and died, as I said, and then there was a memorial for him, and for some reason, crazy reason, I was asked to speak at his memorial. I mean, I don't know why they did it, but they did it. And so I got up there and I gave this exact introduction because this was what I knew about Sam Francis, and everybody in the room got the look of horror on their face, a look of horror. And Taki was in the room. Remember Taki?
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Taki, he was from here. He used to live here until he got busted for cocaine possession. Yeah. And then he moved to New York, I guess for whatever reason. Anyway, Taki's there. We're in this little room, and Taki's there. And I say this, and Taki turns to everyone. He says, we're all going to be arrested. Well, we weren't arrested, you know. And at that point, I decided I really need to explain what I'm talking about here. Why did I say that? And it was at this point I started talking about a book that I wrote. And the book that I was involved in at this time was The Jewish Revolutionary Spirit. Now, why did I get involved? Why did I get involved with this book? I mean, I'm a glutton for punishment. I know that. That's why I do this magazine. I got a guy call me up once, and he said, I finally figured you out. He said, you're a one-legged man in an ass-kicking contest. I said, I think you're right. I think that's exactly right. And if there were ever a manifestation of that, it was taking on this topic and writing the book, The Jewish Revolutionary Spirit. But I felt that I had to do it because of what happened in America. What happened in America at this time? Our country got taken over by a group of people that were known as neoconservatives. But everybody knew that they were Jews. Everybody knew that. You weren't allowed to say it, but everybody knew it. And suddenly, the country is being dragged into a war that nobody wanted. Because this minority of people decided that they needed this war to help support Israel. And so we got dragged into the war with Iraq. I was against it. A lot of people were against it. We got dragged into it anyway. Okay? And I thought, I got to do something about this. What is going on here? We need to identify the problem. Well, what is the problem? Well, I thought it was left and right. I thought if you were a conservative, then you opposed the left, they were communist. You know, a lot of the Jews were communists. Communists were Jews. But now, the left and right didn't seem to apply. As a matter of fact, one of the fathers of neoconservatism, it turns out, was Irving Kristol, and he used to be a Trotskyite back in the 1930s when he went to the City College of New York. Well, they're left. I mean, they're really left. And now he's really right. And we're still in the same mess. So what's the common denominator? And I realized, well, wait a minute. What do they have in common? It's Jews. The Jews were Bolsheviks, and now they're neoconservatives. They're always arguing for some type of war. They're always getting other people to fight for them. And so maybe that's the common denominator that we have to talk about. And so I decided, where did it begin? And I realized it began at the foot of the cross. At the foot of the cross. Because these people were known as Israelites then, and they were God's chosen people. But God gave you free will. Even if you're chosen people, you still have free will. And even when the Messiah comes, and this is Jesus Christ, the Messiah, he arrives on this earth, and you have to choose to accept him. It's not automatic. And you have to choose to accept him on his terms, not your terms. So what do the Jews do when they go to Jesus Christ? They say, we are the sperm of Abraham. We have really special DNA. You really need to take us seriously. This is the beginning of racism. Jesus Christ rejects racism. I don't care, he says so, I don't care what your DNA is. God doesn't care about your DNA. God created you. If you don't want to do it, he can take rocks off the ground and raise them up in your place. We don't need you. You need me. And some of the Jews accepted him, and some of the Jews rejected him. And the Jews that accepted him are known as Christians. And we are the new Israel. We are the children of Moses. We're the ones that Moses followed what Moses said. These people call themselves the children of Moses. They're not, because they rejected the Messiah that Moses waited for. They rejected him. And not only did they reject him, they killed him. They crucified him.
Do you believe in Jesus Christ?
Afterwards,
No, well,
And at this point, you reach the turning point of history, because it's not just did you kill Jesus Christ, he was God. And what do I mean by God? And this is where I came across this new idea. It's not a new idea, it's an old idea. If you read the Gospel of St. John, the first sentence in the Gospel is Ein arche ein ha logos. In the beginning there was, it's translated this word, and I could never understand that. What do you mean, in the beginning was the word? But if you say in the beginning there was logos, logos is the order of the universe. Logos is the mind of God. Logos is the voice in us that tells us what is right and what is wrong. Logos allows us to look at the stars and see a pattern in the sky. That's what God is. Because the next sentence is Kai logos ein theos. And logos is God.
there is no
This
God.
is a huge breakthrough. This is a huge breakthrough in human history. And this is, in a sense, the turning point in human history. Because at this point you have to accept or reject Logos. And the people who rejected Logos rejected every aspect of it. And there's a Logos to social order. There is a social order. There is a moral order. There is a philosophical order. There is an order to the universe. And if you reject this Logos, you reject that order. And what happens when you reject that order? You become revolutionaries. And that's what the Jews...
Please be quiet.
And that's what the Jews...
No, I will not be quiet.
And that's what the Jews...
Revolutionaries.
And that's
We're
what the...
nationalists.
And that's what the Jews have been ever since that. If you let me finish, we'll...
Get back!
And that's what the Jews have been ever since this time. They have been in the forefront of every single revolutionary movement up until this time. They are in the forefront of the revolutionary movement right now in the United States. What is the revolutionary movement right now? What is the revolutionary movement right now? The revolutionary movement in the United States is the movement for homosexual marriage. It has been we've talked about other things, the feminist revolution that led to abortion, one after another, one instance after another, where a small group of people have to figure out a way to impose their will on the overwhelming majority of the people. I wrote a book called Libido Dominandi, Sexual Liberation and Political Control, in which I said basically that this is the most effective form of political control that the world has ever come up with. Because basically you get to, you lock yourself in prison every night, every time you engage in these activities. You become a slave to your own passions, a phrase that Shakespeare used in one of his plays. That led to, it began with the sexual liberation of the 1960s. It began before that in the United States with a battle during the 1930s over Hollywood. People don't like to talk about it, but it was a battle between Catholics and Jews over who was going to control the cultural settings of the United States. And the issue was obscenity. And the issue was smuggling nudity into films and obscenity and blasphemy and all these things. And the Catholics fought the Jews, and they beat the Jews at this time. And as a result, they imposed a code on Hollywood that kept Hollywood, the Hollywood Jews, under control for 31 years, from the middle of the 1930s up until 1965, when the Jews brought out a film called The Pawnbroker, which is basically a Holocaust film that was used to smuggle nudity into films. The Catholic Church has never won a battle since that time. Once they ran up the white flag on that cultural battle, they lost whatever cultural power they had, and there was a direct line of influence from the loss of that power in 1965 up to the Iraqi war and the situation we're in right today. Because once they had no check on them, there was no way the Catholic Church could stop them. It's that simple. That's where we are today. So today, what is the manifestation of the revolutionary spirit? As I said, it's homosexual marriage. I don't know whether you know this or whether it's been apparent to you over here, but we are in the middle of an attack on representative government right now in the United States of America. It began 1 year ago in Indiana. The legislature of the state of Indiana passed something called the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, which said basically if you're running a bakery and a homosexual comes and says, I want you to bake a cake for my gay wedding, you don't have to do it. You can turn it down. This outraged the oligarchs. The oligarchs then orchestrated a counter-campaign against what was going on in Indiana, and it was basically the oligarchs. It was a coalition of three groups of people. It was the CEOs, the capitalists, the heads of the big corporations. It was the homosexuals, who were their proxy warriors in this battle, and it was the Jews, who were the big promoters of homosexual marriage. And together they would come into the state of Indiana, and this is warfare in our day. The people, the legislatures didn't understand it. They thought, war was, the guys with blue uniforms firing cannons at guys with red uniforms. That's not the way warfare is waged in our day. They came in, the legislatures are shocked, they don't know what to do. They revoke their own law. This is a man from San Francisco. Nobody elected him. He's not even from the state of Indiana, and yet he can come in and say, okay, you have to change this law because we are the real rulers of Indiana and you are not. He didn't say that, but that was clearly the message. 1 year later, the same thing happens in North Carolina, except the issue now is, where can you go to the bathroom?
Oh, God. Yes, that one.
I am not making this up. I am not making this up. You may have heard about this.
Yes.
It's the same person. It's Mark Benioff of Salesforce, who now is in the state of North Carolina telling people, no, if someone in his mind thinks he's something and doesn't look that way, he can go into whatever. And the people are outraged, and the people pass a law, and now he's saying, no, you can't pass the law unless the oligarchs say it's okay. Well, that's going to cause a reaction, and it is causing a reaction. It's a worldwide reaction because the oligarchs have overstepped their bounds. And on top of that, the other thing is that we're starting to understand how their system works. Every time they call it freedom, what they're really talking about is a form of control. Because there is no Because there is no freedom from logos. You can't be relieved of your rationality unless you want to be a slave to or become a vegetable. Because that is what makes you free. The fact that you can choose the good, you can see the good, you can see the truth, and you can choose it, and that's what makes you free. And anybody who comes along and says, no, you don't have to follow that law, you can follow your passions, is really trying to enslave you. That has happened over and over and over. I've given a talk all over the world, and I began the talk by talking about the Israelis occupying Ramallah in 2002, one of their many incursions into Palestinian territories. This time, what do? They occupy the TV stations. What do they do after they occupy the TV stations? They broadcast pornography over the TV stations. Now, why did they broadcast pornography over the TV stations? If you go to a film like The People versus Larry Flint, which was made during the debate over the Communications Decency Act, Larry Flint will tell you that pornography means freedom. So that means then that the Israelis want to bring freedom to the Palestinians. Right? No. 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 What it means is that nobody really understands pornography because pornography is a weapon. It's a weapon of psychological warfare. It deranges the mind, and the whole point of this was to derange the mind of these young Palestinians so that they couldn't resist the Israeli occupation. Well, that's a metaphor of what happened to the United States of America and to every country in Europe. I will tell you, I got in trouble because I said the Jews are behind pornography. Well, you go on the internet and you can find article after article which says exactly the same thing. So I'm demonized as an anti-Semite because I said that. Okay, 1 year later, a professor from England writes an article, and it's published in the Jewish Quarterly, and it's on Jews and pornography. It's my article. He said exactly what I said. The only difference is I said it's bad, and he ended it by saying, so what do we have to be ashamed of? Now, we have reached a situation where we have an intolerable situation. An intolerable situation. The same thing happened with gay marriage. Okay? If I say that gay marriage, that the Jews are behind gay marriage, I am condemned as an anti-Semite. If you go to Tikkun magazine, which is a Jewish magazine, you can read an article by a lady by the name of Amy Dean, who is Jewish. And this is what she has to say. This is a direct quote. In a few short years, same-sex marriage went from being an untouchable political hot potato to a broadly accepted civil right in 18 states and the District of Columbia. Jews and their social justice organizations helped make that happen. In fact, this magazine was a prophetic voice of marriage equality, supporting same-sex unions in the early 1990s and helping to lay the groundwork for the current wave of victories. This is intolerable. You just said the same thing I said. Why am I a bad person because I'm saying the same thing? We have reached the point where you can't express any form of criticism of the oligarchs because the oligarchs are in this alliance with the Jews, and the Jews will destroy you if you say anything they don't like. So that means we have to define what anti-Semitism is, because they are never going to define it for us. The late Joe Sobran was at that conference. Someone actually came up to me. This is after Joe Sobran had been purged from National Review for being an anti-Semite. So he's there, and I'm there. I give the talk, and then we're just standing there. And somebody says, oh, two of you, Joe Sobran and Mike Jones, let's have a picture. So I'm standing there, I put my arm around Joe, and I said, Joe, this picture with me is going to ruin your career. And Joe looked at me and he said, mutually assured destruction. So what did Joe Soberman say? Joe Soberman would say, an anti-Semite used to be someone that didn't like Jews. Now it's someone that Jews don't like. Let me refine it a little bit. I hate to follow. It's such a hard act to follow, but what is an anti-Semite? An anti-Semite is someone who criticizes Jews. That's it. That's the whole thing in a nutshell. You can say exactly the same thing that the Jew says, but if you're perceived as criticizing the Jews, you are a bad person and we're going to destroy you. And they have tried, you know. By the grace of God, they haven't succeeded. But that doesn't change their intention in the matter. I was in Poland giving a speech. Libido Dominandi got translated into Polish, and I did a tour of Poland. And I'm going to my first speech. And the publisher's in the front seat, and the phone keeps ringing. And he's talking in Polish, and I don't understand Polish, but I know it's bad. I know it's bad. So he gets off the phone, and basically all the newspapers are saying, E. Michael Jones is in town, he's an anti-Semite. And there's going to be a huge demonstration tomorrow in Wrocław. We're in Warsaw now, we're going to Wrocław tomorrow. At the John Paul II Center. So I walk in there. We're going to be speaking at the cathedral, the Catholic cathedral. Walk in, I'm feeling bad. I go into church and I say a prayer, which I do frequently. And believe me, I wouldn't be here if I hadn't said a lot of prayers. I'll tell you that right now. I walk out of there, and who's to greet me but the Chancellor of the Archdiocese, and he says to me, don't worry. Don't worry. So I don't worry. I walk in, I give my speech. Everything's fine. I have a line of people walking all the way around the block to buy autographed copies of my book. What happened there? What happened there was Catholic unity prevailed over Jewish subversion. For once in my life, I got the support. For once in my life, I got the support of someone in the Catholic Church. I don't want to bitch and moan, but you know, it's been difficult because what you have, what is a Catholic? A Catholic loves to internalize the commands of his oppressor. He loves to be considered a good person in the eyes of people who are his enemy, and as a result, he becomes completely ineffective. Jesus Christ never said that we would not have enemies, but he said we should love our enemies. We should love our enemies. And I know you're shaking your head, but I believe that. It's hard to do sometimes, but I believe. So I'm telling you right now, I love the Jews. Why do I love the Jews? Because they are my enemy. Because I know they are they are not my enemy. This is the Christian reaction. This is what Jesus Christ told me to do. I'm just following the book that they gave me. If you read 1 Thessalonians 2, St. Paul says, the Jews, they are the people that killed Christ. They are enemies of the entire human race. I didn't say that. St. Paul said that. I'm a follower of this guy. Why am I the only guy talking this way? Don't these people read the Bible? I went to Rome. I visited with a high official in the Vatican. It's Department of State. I said, you know, we got a problem here. You're not preaching the gospel. That's the gospel. I don't know what you're preaching. I said there are 3 areas: church and state, the Jews, usury. You're not preaching this gospel. He said, forget about the Jews. Nobody's going to talk about it here. Okay. But he said, if you give me something on usury, I'll put it in the encyclical. Well, I did, and he did. So it's in the encyclical. It's in Laudate Si, if you want to read it. And then on when the Pope last September went to the United Nations, he said the U word. He said usury. First time a Pope has said this in over 100 years. So, you know, it's a mixed bag. And I'm here to say that the struggle is worth it. But the struggle is, before we get involved in a big struggle, it would be good to figure out how we got into this mess. How did we get into this mess where we are controlled by three groups of people who are by definition no more than 1% of the population? The oligarchs. Remember Occupy Wall Street? We coined the term the 1%. Goldman Sachs. The Jews, 1% of the society, and the homosexuals, 1% of the society. How do we get to this point? How do we get to this point? The answer is lack of unity. Remember what I said about unity? Where did the lack of unity begin? When did it begin? It began in England with the Reformation. Remember Mr. Tyndall and Elizabethan England? What was Elizabethan England? It was a police state. It was the first police state. And if you didn't like it, you got drawn and quartered. And it was so intolerable that the English themselves rose up against it. They could not stand this police state. What was the police state? Why did they have that police state? What was the Reformation? The Reformation was a looting operation. It was a looting operation. It was the theft. It was the theft of the property of the Catholic Church by greedy aristocrats, head of which was Henry VIII, the greediest of all the aristocrats. That property, and at this point, if I really sound eloquent, it's because I'm quoting William Cobbett's History of the Reformation in England and Ireland, which is one of the great pieces of English prose ever. For 900 years, England had a society, a culture, an economy, where the wealth of the nation was put to productive use for the people of the nation. Cobbett said you could walk, before the Reformation, you could walk 6 miles in any direction, and you'd find a place that would take you in for the night. And if you were sick, they would nurse you back to health. And this was the social welfare network that made England a prosperous country. It was owned by the church, but it was used by the people. There were purgatory societies here, where a man who wanted to get out of purgatory for his sins, he would say, I have this piece of land, you can graze your sheep on this piece of land if you pray for my soul. And they did, and the people prospered, and it was a country where wealth was widely distributed. At a certain point, the oligarchs of that day decided they couldn't risk the temptation anymore, and they stole all of that property, and they privatized it. Remember privatization? Well, this was real privatization. And suddenly all those people that were grazing their lands on common ground, that was all enclosed, and they were thrown off, and they became beggars and criminals because they had nothing else to do. And said you had poor laws. And this is what Cobbett was talking about. It was a looting operation, and then you had to sort of sprinkle holy water on the looting operation and say it had some type of theological justification. The best quote, I'm another great English writer, R.H. Tawney, Religion and the Rise of Capitalism, trying to figure out what happened. Then he said, the upstart aristocracy had their teeth in the carcass, and they weren't going to be whipped off with a sermon. That's the Reformation. They had their teeth in the carcass. So hire somebody to write a homily about how it's a justifiable system. It was not. Religion, conscience, was always the pretext, but in one way or another, robbery, plunder was always the end. The people, once so united and so happy, became divided into innumerable sects. No man knowing hardly what to believe, and indeed no one knowing what it was lawful for him to say. For it soon became impossible for the common people to know what was heresy and was not heresy. When the Catholic Church was overthrown and plundered, England became a den of thieves, and thieves of the lowest and most despicable order. The initial plundering of church property became the vehicle for the next wave of exploitation, and that was usury. If you want a first-person account, watch Shakespeare's play Timon of Athens. It's about England being taken over by the usurers. The looters lost their loot to the usurers, and then usury became the acceptable behavior. Again, William Cobbett. Thus arose loans, funds, banks, bankers, banknotes, national debt, things that England had never heard of or dreamed of. He's referring to the Glorious Revolution here, which was a reenactment of the whole thing. Preserving the Protestant religion as by law established, things without which she had long and glorious career of many centuries, and had been the greatest and happiest country in the world. Things which she never would have, could have, or heard of had it not been for what is audaciously called the Reformation. Seeing that to lend money at interest, this is to say for gain, that is to receive money for the use of money, seeing that to do this was contrary and still contrary to the principles of the Catholic Church, and amongst Christian or professors of Christianity, such a thing was never heard of before that which is impudently called the Reformation. All declare that to take money for the use of money is sinful. Indeed, no such thing was ever attempted to be justified until the savage Henry VIII had cast off the supremacy of the Pope. Jews did it, but then Jews had no civil rights. They existed by mere sufferance. They could be shut up or banished or even sold at the king's pleasure. They were regarded as a sort of monster who professed to be the lineal descendants and to hold the opinions of those who had murdered the Son of God and the Savior of men. They were not permitted to practice their blasphemies openly. If they had synagogues, they were unseen by the people. The horrid wretches themselves were compelled to keep out of public view on Sundays and on saints' days. They were not allowed to pollute with their presence the streets or the roads of a Christian country on days set aside for public devotion. In degraded wretches like these, usury was tolerated just for the same cause that incest is tolerated among dogs. That's William Cobbett. That ain't me. I wish I had said that. The real purpose of the Glorious Revolution was usury. The Reformation led to the Glorious Revolution. The Glorious Revolution led to widespread use of usury, and the widespread use of usury led to the Jewish control of England. By the 1840s, the Jewish problem had become too big to ignore. This is the time when Disraeli wrote his novel Coningsby, if you remember that, where he says the country is not ruled by those you think it is ruled by. When Napoleon crossed the Rhine, the German princes panicked, knowing that Napoleon's first goal was the confiscation of their wealth. As a result, the Prince of Hesse-Kassel gave his gold to Meyer Amschel Rothschild, who then sent it out of the country to his son Nathan, who was living in London at the time. Having inside information about Napoleon's defeat at the Battle of Waterloo, Nathan made a fortune by using the Prince of Hesse-Kassel's gold to speculate on the British consul. You probably know the story. The battle's going on. Rothschild starts to sell. Okay, everybody turns and looks, what's Rothschild? Everybody rushes to sell, the price goes down, and then he comes in and makes a killing. And that is the foundation of Jewish wealth in England. As a result, he became the richest man in England. Over the course of the next century, the Rothschild family and other Jewish usurers used that wealth to enslave the English aristocracy with debt. Don't take my word, read Mr. Cannondine's book. The whole history of the 19th century, in a nutshell, is English aristocrats' extravagant expenditure, borrowing money, mortgaging their lands, and then losing their properties to the Jews who held the mortgage. The best example I can give is the Churchill family. You've all heard of Winston Churchill, right?
I think so.
Okay. This is an especially flamboyant example of what I'm talking about. The trajectory was the same. Moral depravity leading to extravagance. Extravagance leading to indebtedness. Indebtedness leading to control by Jewish moneylenders, and control by Jewish moneylenders leading to the loss of property and the eclipse of political power. That's what happened. Let's be straight, let's be clear about what happened and who did what before we go charging off. One of those, Randolph, you can buy a book called Churchill and the Jews by a man named Martin Gilbert. And on the front page of that, front cover of that book, you will see a picture. And there's a picture of Randolph Churchill and Natty Rothschild sitting next to each other. And you can open the book and you will never find an explanation of that picture in that book, oddly enough. Because the story here is that Randolph Churchill died 80,000 pounds in debt, an enormous amount of money at that time, to Natty Rothschild. And Natty Rothschild, all the biographers say it was an act of magnanimity because Rothschild forgave the debt. No, he didn't do that. He got the son instead. The son was Winston Churchill, and Winston Churchill at that point became a pawn of Jewish power. Now again, don't take my word, take Canondine's word. One of the most influential Jewish moneylenders was Lord Randolph's old friend, Sir Ernest Cassel. This is what he has to say about him. He's not, this is what Canondine says. Ernest Cassel was widely disliked and distrusted as a cosmopolitan financier whose loyalty was neither to party or nation, but only to profits. Does that sound familiar? As a German, a Jew, a millionaire, and a friend of King Edward II, he seemed a classic example of the unscrupulous and unpatriotic plutocrat who was disfiguring public life, an irresponsible wire puller who had poor politicians in his pocket, and one of them was Winston Churchill because he paid off his debts. Churchill was such a profligate a man who could not control his passions. He immediately got in debt again. The guy could not stay out of debt. Throughout the 1930s, this is Canondine again, Churchill's finances were in a truly parlous condition. Chartwell, the place he bought, continued to absorb money like a sponge. In 1931, his overdraft stood at £9,500. 7 years later, after the crash on Wall Street, he owed £18,000. At this point, guess what happens? Another Jew steps forward. This time, it's Sir Harry Strakosch. Canondine mentions him, and then he says, cast a dig at David Irving, saying, David Irving exposed in his book, but this doesn't mean that Churchill was controlled by the Jews. Well, yes, it does. That's exactly what it means. If there's ever a form of control, it is debt. If you can ever, this is the system we have now. This is the worldwide system that imposed by, I hate to admit it, but my country on the rest of the world. Of course, we got the idea from you. I don't feel all that bad about this. But what is the basic system of control in this world right now? It is sodomy and usury. First of all, we enter your country and we talk about how you need to respect sexual minorities, or you need to liberate your women, or you need to give free access of pornography to your media, that we will sexualize your entire culture, and you will become so besotted with your own passions that you won't realize that the usurers are now coming in. And now the usurers will get your country in debt, and you will be a total slave. So I agree with everyone here who says that the point of this system is creating slaves. That's what it is here to do. And that's what this is. And we are here to reassert our freedom from this system of slavery. It's the most pernicious system that the world has ever devised because it's the most effective enslaving system in the world. When I go to Iran, they refer to it as the Great Satan. And they're right. They're right. Because how does Satan control you? Does he put a gun to your head? No. He seduces you. And that's what the Great Satan does as well. So here we are. This leads us up to the end of the 19th century. And suddenly everybody realizes that the Jews are in control of Europe. And even the Catholic Church awakes to it. And there is a three-part series in Civiltà Cattolica, which appears in 1890. And the gist of this This is an official publication of the Vatican. It had the official approval of the Pope. And what is the conclusion they come to? It was basically an examination of the French Revolution. What is the consequence of the French Revolution? And I read this thing, and suddenly this sentence leapt off the page at me. Any country that turns away from the laws that are established by Christian kings to protect the Christian people will end up being ruled by Jews. That's France. What did they have? They had the French Revolution. That's England. The same thing happened in England. I just gave you the examples there. It's America. The same thing that happened in America. It happened in America more recently. You may have heard Mr. Trump talking about America first. This was a battle in the 1930s of the Americans who did not want to get involved in World War II. Charles Lindbergh was the leader of America first. That's what he's trying to call. This is Little America. You've heard of Little England. In a sense, you're Little England, aren't you? You're the hobbits who don't want the orcs controlling the country. Well, this is Little America. And Little America doesn't want to send their kids off to die for Israel in Iraq. And anytime you stand up for Little America, guess what they call you? An anti-Semite. You're not surprised. That's what happened, and all of Europe happened, and it happened to all of Europe. Everyone realized it, and at a certain point, even the Pope Benedict's uncle wrote a book. Georg Ratzinger wrote a book called Jüdisches Erwerbsleben, and he said, this rage is growing in Europe. He's writing this in 1890. The rage is growing. The people feel betrayed by their own leaders. Why do they feel betrayed by their own leaders? Because their leaders are all in debt to the Jews. Because if you get in debt to the Jew and then he doesn't like what you're doing, he won't roll over your loan. And you'll lose your farm. You'll lose your estate. That's how they control, and they were controlling it then. And Ratzinger's saying, we have to enforce Christian laws, because if they don't, there's going to be a violent reaction. As soon as these people find a leader, guess what the German word for leader is? And he used the F word. As soon as they find ein Führer, and they found der Führer. Sie haben den Führer gefunden. They found their leader in 1933. And it was a violent reaction, and it's not the reaction that Georg Ratzinger wanted. It's not the reaction that Civiltà Cattolica wanted. They didn't want it. But the fact of the matter is, if you don't act, if you, the leaders of the people, do not represent the people, if you do not represent their interest, if you represent the interests of the people who put money in your pocket as opposed to the people who vote for you, there will be a violent reaction. And I will pray, I say prayers a lot. I will pray that it doesn't come to that. And I will pray that why are we here now to prevent that type of violent reaction. To seek the path of peace. So that we can all find a modus vivendi, so that we don't... What do the oligarchs want us to do? They want us to fight each other. That's what they want. I guarantee you, I've seen it, I've talked it, it happens. I lived through this as a young man because I was involved. I was a guinea pig in a social engineering experiment for my entire life, and nobody ever told me about it. And the biggest social engineering experiment I grew up with was black migration out of the South. That was I wrote a book called The Slaughter of Cities, if you want to read about it. It's called Urban Renewal, it's ethnic cleansing, and basically it was about the ethnic cleansing of ethnic Catholics in the big cities of the United States. And these people, have you ever seen The Godfather?
Yeah.
Do you remember that procession in The Godfather where they're carrying... This is what ethnic America was like. You had little colonies of Little Italy and Germantown and Chinatown and Jewtown and all these other little ethnic colonies, and they all had their little culture, and we all kind of got along, and it was destroyed because the oligarchs thought these people had too much power. And they did it by bringing the black people up from the South. and they didn't know what was going on, and we didn't know what was going on, and they told, as soon as you see a black person, you become white. I didn't know I was white. I thought I was Irish. I thought I was German. But suddenly the black person shows up, and you're white. Well, I'm not white. And my wife is teaching in Southwest Philadelphia during this war. This is civil war in Philadelphia, and an Irish family moves into the neighborhood, and the kid ends up being killed by a black gang because he didn't know he was white. He thought he was Irish. Well, he got caught up in a war that he didn't know about. And I'm saying what we do not want is a replay of that war, because what we really saw there was the Black Jewish Alliance and the Jews using black people as their pawns to drive other people out of their cultures and destroy their cultures. I mean, what am I, a kid? I'm 4 years old. I'm 5 years old when we have to move out of our Irish neighborhood and move to some kind of deracinated suburb. But if I had to do it again, I'd go to the black people and I'd say, look, it's not in your interest and it's not in my interest. They're the ones who are controlling it. They're using both of us. So let's collaborate. How do we collaborate? What is the basis for collaboration? There's only one basis for collaboration among human beings, and it's logos. Remember logos? That is the order of the universe. That is who we are. I told you, I've been to Iran. I was in Iran. I was walking down the street celebrating the revolution. The 34th anniversary of the revolution. I'm surrounded by women in chadors. And they're all shouting something. And I know Allah Akbar, but this isn't Allah Akbar. So I turned to my translator and I said, what are they saying? And he said, death to America. There are 3 million people in this march, and I'm the only guy wearing a tie and a tweed jacket. And so someone comes up to me and he says, are you an American? And I was tempted to say, no, I'm a Canadian. But I said, yes, I'm an American. And he said, I'd like to come to America. So the Iranians are geniuses when it comes to separating the people from an evil regime. In other words, yes, I understand why you're saying death to America, but they understood that I, as an American, was not necessarily their enemy. As a matter of fact, that I could help them. So they take me down to a town in the middle of nowhere. It's called Fazaa. And it's next to the hottest place on earth. They recorded a temperature of 159 degrees from a satellite, so it's not the official record. But anyway, I show up there after a long drive through the desert, pull into town, there's a billboard. And I look up at the billboard and I think, that face looks familiar. It's me. I'm advertised, the talk is advertised on a billboard. I walk into the room and there are 500 people there who have been waiting 2 hours to hear me speak. Now, I'm in a situation where I do not speak Farsi. I know this is a shock. It comes as a shock to me. My life, so I meet my translator. We get to the hotel, I meet my translator. Cute little girl. She looks like an airline stewardess. And we get into the car. First thing out of her mouth is, I hear you're an anti-Semite. I said, you're calling me an anti-Semite? I said, every building has death to Israel written on it. And you're calling me an anti-Semite here? This is ridiculous. Anyway, so I get in there, we get there, and I realize my life is in her hands. My life is in her hands. Because if she says something wrong, suppose she mistranslate what I said. There are 500 people. They were closer to me than you are right now. 500 very passionate people who feel that America is the great Satan and know that I'm an American. If they wanted to, they could have dragged me out and strung me up from a lamppost. But they didn't. And why didn't they do that? You know what the answer is? It's logos. Again, it's speech. Because I could speak even through the medium of a translator, and she could convey the truth of what I had to say and the reasonableness of what I had to say. And that's all we have. That's all we have right now. And the fact of the matter is that we can't be picky at this point. The only people, we can't exclude anyone who accepts logos, because you're talking about reasonable people. We cannot exclude reasonable people. Now, we can talk about the Jews, because they are the people that rebelled against logos, didn't they? They killed logos Okay? So we can talk about that, and we can talk openly to them and say, okay, I know you don't like to hear this, but I feel compelled to say this. And you know, what happens? Sometimes you actually convert them. So I've actually converted Jews by talking to them in this way. That's what we're talking about. That's what we need. That's why we cannot blow this moment. Because we have to understand, who are we dealing with? Who is the opponent here? Is it like the black guy on the corner in southwest Philadelphia that was caught up in a movement that he didn't understand? Another form of migration as weapon? That was certainly what happened to us. It was the same thing that happened to them. No, that's not the issue here. What is the issue? The issue is the Jewish revolutionary spirit that promotes this migration to destroy the cultures of the people they don't like, which is pretty much everybody. It's not just you white guys. It's everybody in the world. The Iranians as well, they have a full-blown cultural warfare going on there, complete with pornography and feminism and everything else. And they are fighting for their survival. And if I can do anything to help them, I will be happy to do it. That's my job. That's why God created me. Okay? So what I'm saying here, do we need more Jewish revolutionaries? No, we don't. What do we need? What do we need? We need a new paradigm. So I'm going to humbly propose to you a new paradigm. It's something you're already familiar with. It's something that I told the Iranians, because that's what I'm talking about. I'm talking about 3 Iranians, or they used to be known as 3 Persians, or we know them as the 3 Magi. These were the first 3 non-Hebrews who worshiped Jesus Christ. They had that privilege. Why did they have that privilege? How did they get that privilege? Well, they were astronomers. They studied the sky. What did they see in the sky? That there's an order up there. It's not just random. This order is a manifestation of the mind of God. And if you study anything and you learn the truth about it, you're getting close to the mind of God. So that's the first reason. The first reason. They saw the Logos. They said, this Logos is bigger than me, and it's bigger than my will. And so therefore I should subordinate my will, to his Logos. And that's the way of happiness. Okay, that's the first reason. Second reason, they had the courage to act on their convictions when they knew the truth. So first of all, you have to know the truth. You have to understand the Logos of the situation. And the second thing is, you have to have the courage to act on it. Because it's worthless if you don't act. So what happened? The star appears, and they follow the star. They follow the star. Do you have the courage to follow the star? That's the big question of your life, isn't it? Do you have the courage? I mean, maybe you're too stupid to see the star. Well, then you're excluded. But if you're smart enough to see the star, do you have the courage to follow it? Because that's what they did. And it led them to the Logos incarnate, the center of human history, the being, the God that the Jews would end up killing, because they didn't want to follow that. They were proud of their DNA, and they're not going to follow anybody but their DNA. And what's the final thing that they did that makes an example for us? They went home by a different way. Do you remember that? Do you remember that part? Do you know why they went home by a different way? Because of Herod. In other words, the ruler understood these guys are intelligent people. I'll recruit them into my CIA. I will turn them into informants on the Logos. So Herod says, I'd like to worship your new king too, so come back and tell me. And they were smart enough to realize that this is a genocidal plot. It ended up being that way. It's called the slaughter of the innocents. They murdered all those people. And they said, we don't want to be part of your genocide. We don't want to be a part of your imperial schemes. And so they went home a different way. And that's what I'm saying we need to do. We need to go home by a different way. In other words, we got to get back to England by a different way. We got to get back to America by a different way. Okay? That's the task before us. Why is that the task before us? Because the West has failed. Do you know what that's from? Do you know who said that?
No.
Denethor said that.
Who?
In your book, The Lord of the Rings, remember? You hobbits, don't you remember the Lord of the Rings? Do you remember the scene in The Lord of the Rings that I'm talking about here? Denethor is the representative of the West. He's a deputy. He's not the real king, but we're waiting for the return of the king. And he loses hope. There's a battle going on. We're fighting at the gates of Minas Tirith. Okay? The orcs are coming over the walls, and you are saying you lost hope, and he ends up throwing himself on the funeral pyre. So when I was in Poland, I ended my speech and I said, the West has failed. Of course, they didn't like to hear that. Because they just signed on with the West, remember? Communism. And then I said, but if you remember that, that was not the end of the story, was it? And I said, no, it wasn't the end. The riders of Rohim showed up. And who were the riders of Rohim? They were obviously the Polish cavalry. Well, everybody cheered at that point. So unfortunately, you're hobbits and you're not the riders of Rohim. But anyway, the story is the same. Why did the West fail? Because we turned away from the laws of Christian kings. And when we turned away from those laws, we ended up being ruled by Jews. That's the situation we're in right now. There's only one alternative, and that is the Magi, which means we have to return to the Logos that inspired them. The Logos that made England a prosperous country for 900 years before the looters took it over. That's the situation we're in right now. Why are we followers? Why are we followers of Logos? What does that mean? Who is the enemy? The enemy is anyone who feels that will is superior to Logos. That will is superior to Logos. That means the Takfiri, ISIS, the liver eaters, the head chopper offers in Syria right now. But it also means the Nietzscheans among us, Michel Foucault. All these people who say that somehow you can assert your will and that will make it right. No, that's not the issue. We believe in subordinating our will to the Logos. We believe in following the star which symbolizes the Logos, which is God. With the Magi as our role model in mind, we ask for the courage to follow that star wherever it leads us. Thank you.
Say, orcs are coming and our rage is growing. So let's kick ass. And let's thank a two-legged man who is winning the ass-kicking contest, Michael Jones.